Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast, presented by Strategic Treasurer, your source for interesting Treasury news, analysis, and insights in your car, at the gym, or wherever you decide to tune in.
Welcome to the Treasury Update podcast. This is Craig Jeffery. I'm your host today. I'm joined by Paul McMeekin from Bottomline Technologies. Our episode today is titled Payment Fraud Accelerates and Morphs. It accelerates and morphs. It's a great description of what's occurring, and we'll be sharing some information by background on that from the Treasury Fraud Controls Survey and research that we just did together. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me on, Craig. I'm pretty excited to talk about this topic today.
Yeah, it seems like it's got to be one of the top topics about what's happening and how dangerous it is, but it's good when we think about putting controls in place.
Yeah, absolutely. I was out at AFP, 3-4 weeks ago, and I think every other conversation talked about fraud of some kind, right? Of how to prevent it. Some people, unfortunately, had some fraud incidents we talked through there of what you can do to prevent it in the future. But it's as we dive deeper into this, it's a mix of old techniques and also some new techniques as well, right? So I'm pretty excited to talk through this.
Yeah, that's excellent. So yeah, the top topics are either AI fraud or AI fraud. So the Treasury Fraud Controls Survey, just for those listening in, the 2025 version, I think was probably the 15th iteration. We've been running the survey for a long time, and Bottomline has helped underwrite that for almost every single instance, and so it's fun. So we had well over 200 corporate respondents. There's about 80 questions, and it covered the globe. The heaviest participation was North America, where 92% of companies had some operations in North America. Europe was 41%, and Asia Pacific 31%, LATAM, Latin and South America 29%. So very, very good and global survey. And this is, we have a lot of data, and you're encouraged to download the report by going to strategictreasurer.com. You can look for research, surveys, find it, download it. It's free to download it. A lot of good information. A special thanks to Bottomline for underwriting again, and to everybody who took time to take the survey. But Paul, I want to get into some of the content, not necessarily just of the survey, but about what's going on for which the survey speaks about. So maybe you could give us an overview about what's happening with the corporate fraud experience. It's changing. We use the title Morphing and Accelerating. So that's certainly the context, but maybe you could talk us through some of the events.
Yeah, I think I want to express my thanks as well for all those participants, because without the survey respondents, there's no meaty data that we get to talk through and geek out about, right? So I think that the headline for me at the top of the report, it's basically 76%, so more than 3/4 of companies experience or suspected fraud in the past 12 months. And that is persistently a high rate, right? So that's the big headline news of almost everyone experienced or suspected fraud in the past 12 months. And I think that threat level is rising. So historically, if you look back, it's 73, 74%, and 77% said fraud risk has increased in the past year. And so I've thrown out a lot of percentage points there. What I would say is that almost all companies of all different sizes experienced or suspected fraud in the past 12 months, particularly in smaller companies, right? They are seeing those fraud rates rise a lot faster. They are catching up, what I'd say in a bad way, to their larger peers. And so if you put yourself in the shoes of fraudsters, most big organizations right now, they have defenses in place. They are experiencing fraud attacks. They are thwarting them. Those smaller businesses, small, medium-sized businesses, they may not have those defense mechanisms in place yet. So they are seeing those fraud rates catch up in a very bad way to those larger companies. And I think the losses due to fraud is starting to grow significantly. So there was an 11-point jump for small businesses since 2023. And those companies, man, it is expensive, Craig. As you know, from the survey data, that this isn't, $5-10. It's, hundreds of thousands of dollars and millions. And as we go through the rest of this conversation, I've got a few things to share from the research I've done where it's like, oh, wow, $35 billion in synthetic identity fraud. But I think what's really interesting is the mix of fraud is evolving and changing.
Yeah, Paul, I think you brought up a lot of good points. I wanted to underline a couple of things you said. You mentioned, it's basically like 3/4 of experienced fraud or had it, or there was attempted fraud, and there was another 70, like 3/4 essentially said it had increased significantly. The threat of fraud increased over the prior year. And that's significant by itself. But this is year over year. We're seeing those numbers repeat. So the last year was worse than this year was worse than last year. Last year was worse than the year before. That year was worse than the year before that. It's like this continual compounding. And that's such a serious thing. It's not just, hey, it's about the same. It's worse getting on top of worse. And I think you made a really good point with that. And your point about smaller organizations, the level of sometimes smaller organizations think they're not after us. We don't have that much money, right? The famous bank robber Willie Sutton had, when asked the question, why do you rob from banks? He said, that's where the money is. And there's always that potential and look of, hey, they're just going after the bigger companies, and they are, and that's growing. The bigger companies is huge and growing. The attacks made on them. Smaller companies are catching up really rapidly. And, I think to your point, that's, there's more tech and they're using it and they're going after it more. But so really good points, Paul, on that. What are some of the new types of fraud that we're seeing, in the corporate space in particular?
Yeah, I would say there's a twist on the old fraud first before we talk about the new stuff. So the old fraud, check fraud, it still remains a big concern. So when we speak to banks, when we speak to corporations, they say check fraud, traditional check fraud is evolving. And so if you think of a lot of states across the country are trying to make it easy to do business and fast to set up a new entity. So what we're seeing is mail theft and positive pay really accelerating check fraud. And the way they're doing it is, so fraudsters intercept mail checks, then they exploit the business registration loopholes to create fake doing business as entities. So McMeekin Landscaping, as an example, they may steal a check, they deposit the stolen checks into accounts with matching names, bypassing some of the positive pay controls, and that lag in check reconciliation, sometimes multiple weeks, many months, means frauds can go undetected until it's too late. So this kind of combination of mail theft, pro-business from state governments, and compromised positive pay is making checks like super risky, more risky than ever. And then it's pushing businesses towards digital payments like A-Station cards. And so this urgency to move away from paper checks has never been higher. And then you talk about new fraud. As I was doing some background research for this, I came across Fraud GPT. And so for $200 a month, so security researchers first found Fraud GPT, I think it was 2023. And think of it as a dark mirror of ChatGPT, so similar to other large language models. But it's kind of like ChatGPT without any of the ethical safeguards. So a threat actor can ask in very plain English for a spear phishing email, a copycat login site, a way to exploit a known vulnerability, or any other number of malicious tools. So the reply in plain English also gives the user the information they need to carry out very effective cyber attacks. And it's $200 a month. And so you think of the cost traditionally of a fraud attack was quite high. So the cost is high to get started. I'm going to target those big guys, right? Now the cost is $200 a month. I can run it to every organization, whether it's a small company or a big company. The cost of doing business as a fraud criminal is rock bottom. And so you remove some of those economical barriers, and the incentive, it doesn't have to be as big. And so if I can run it quite cheaply, I can run my fraud shop quite cheaply. I can target a small company for $10,000, or I can target a big company for $1 million. And so that's what we're seeing in the marketplace. It's really coming in two types of fraud, I think. So one is synthetic identity fraud, which involves creating fake personas using real and fabricated data, making detection super difficult, right? And I think in the survey, about a third of organizations are prepared for it, and about another third are unsure if they've actually encountered it or not. So that's a big, significant awareness gap in the industry, I think. So conversations like this will always be helpful. And I think the biggest one I'm aware of, I mentioned 35 billion before. That was during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so fraudsters used synthetic identities to access that emergency government benefits and loans. And once those funds dried up, they shifted to opening new accounts at FIs and banks, building up credit and then defaulting on the loans. And so this trend was highlighted by, I think it was the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, which said that the synthetic identity fraud losses cost 35 billion in 2023, which is, it's an absurd amount of money, right? It's crazy. And then the other one, well, you mentioned at the top, right, is AI and AI. I think the data says this, 14% of all small have seen increasing fraud attempts using AI generated content, whether it's documents, it's voice, it's videos. And the one trend which I've picked upon is called CEO fraud, where a lot of CEOs of particularly publicly traded companies are public figures. Criminals are using AI for super convincing phishing. They've got deepfakes, document forgery. So if you imagine, I think there's a story out there of a US-based automotive manufacturer. They lost, I think it was about $250,000 to an AI-powered invoice fraud, with the funds eventually ending up in Hong Kong. And the attackers used generative AI to create convincing fake invoices and emails, and they exploit a compromised supplier down in Mexico. So we've noticed that manufacturing companies, construction companies, logistic companies are increasingly targeted with industry losses between $50,000 and $1 million. And so they are wild. And I mentioned that fraud GPT before. You can actually go on the dark web and buy invoice fraud kits. So you don't even have to be a very skilled criminal these days. So you can launch convincing attacks. And I think that the last one, I would say there's a mix of AI and synthetic fraud together. And so there are cases where deepfakes, these AI generated video and audio, and I mentioned those public figures, they're used to support synthetic identity fraud. There was a finance clerk was tricked into approving a $25 million transfer to overseas after a video call with deepfake recreations of real co-workers, including the CFO. So this, Craig, I think this really illustrates how synthetic identities and AI can be combined for super high value fraud. It's scary.
Yeah, it is. That fraud you were talking about with the deepfake videos, it was months ago now, and yeah, it's 25 million. That's a pretty significant payout. And think of how much better the video portion has gotten. Like they did it.
Oh, it's crazy.
They said our connection isn't so good, so they took it off of video and went to just voice. You said a couple things too. It's like the democratization of criminalization, right? You can go for $200, you can have crime as a service, right? Like make this spear phishing thing, and you mentioned another example of you can go and get these fraud kits. Well, they also market their stuff. It's like, hey, our invoice recreation tools match font size. We have all these font detection. Like they talk about how good their tools are to make it look real, as opposed to, sometimes you get this weird font size because the criminals didn't pay enough attention in AI class. So, and and some of them are targeting people, particularly the larger companies. They're capturing information, tracking where they are, what they're doing, so that everything is convincing. So it's real and it's serious. So thanks for sharing that. I was wondering too, Paul, if you would just give an introduction of, who is Bottomline? I think most people know that listen to this, but I think you should give a little bit of overview of that. And then what's your remit or responsibilities at Bottomline?
Yeah, for sure. So for those who don't know about Bottomline, we are a 35, almost 36 years old company, and we were named after the bottom line of a check. That's where our name comes from. So we power payments across the globe. We have thousands of companies who rely on us. Almost, I actually think it's millions of companies now. Here in the United States, we are primarily known for a few things. One is digital banking. We have a digital banking platform. And the other one is Paymode. It's our own private business payments network. It has over 600,000 network members on it, so businesses who are paying and receiving payments on the network to the tune of $500 billion each year. In the UK, we have a payments network called PTX, and it's about half of the direct debits in the UK run through our software. So I don't know what the definition of important is to a national economy, but it feels like we're pretty important both here in the US and the UK as well. So my role in particular, I'm in corporate North America, we call it. So I help our customers understand how to digitize their payments, how to reduce checks and avoid fraud. So we go to market directly to corporates and also through our bank and fintech partners as well.
Awesome. Excellent. Thanks for stepping through that. I always find that helpful to hear about the company, even though I know Bottomline, just you hear a little bit more and more. I would say 50% of the direct debit activity would be a pretty significant payment rail, if you will. So, we talked about fraud. One of the things when we talk about fraud, it's always like, it's scary, it's big, it's getting bigger. They're using better tools. We have to be better in our defenses. We have to use technology. We have to, if the crime is morphing, the criminals are morphing, it's accelerating and morphing, we have to morph and adapt. So what are some of the things that you would say a company needs to do to protect their cash and their payment streams?
Great question. I think, we sell anti-fraud solutions. So what I'm going to say sounds a little bit self-serving, but I actually believe in it, right? So it's, I think you have to invest in AI and machine learning for fraud prevention. And I think the data said about 40%, 4 out of 10 are planning to increase spending here, up from 5% just a few years ago. So I think that is probably one of the biggest areas I think there's data mining, anomaly detection, biometrics. We are all super annoyed when we log into a bank account and we have two-factor authentication. But it's for our own protection, and bringing that mindset, I think, to the corporate environment, because cyber criminals, I think it's called criminals these days, so they're always looking for the weakest link, right? So if your company underinvests in fraud detection, you become an easy target. So if I'm investing in fraud and you're not, Craig, and they try me, like, oh no, he's locked down. Oh, let me go and try Craig over here. He is, and you haven't invested in that AI detection, machine learning, or any of that, you become a much easier target. And I think these organized fraudsters, these fraud rings, they use automation and AI to scan for and exploit gaps in security. They can often bypass companies with strong defenses, but they're looking though for those who have outdated or minimal controls. And I think we mentioned small businesses at the start. Small businesses or those with limited resources, they're particularly vulnerable, I think. And so one of the big wow stats for me, as I've studied this and learned it, is that fraud losses average about 5% of annual revenue for an affected company. And so I think investing in robust layered fraud prevention really sends a clear signal to criminals. Not here, move on to the next guy. And the next guy may or may not have strong controls.
Yeah, that's sobering. One of the aspects that you and I were talking about, like if the crime is accelerating and morphing, what has to be done? And it's kind of like this arms race or this war. It's like you come with a club, I have a spear, I can get you from a distance, then you get a gun, and then I get a mortar or artillery. What should be the perspective? And I think you hinted at it with, companies are accelerating their investments and protecting themselves. What are some of the perspectives that are useful here?
Yeah, I think if you kind of step through it from what controls are growing but are still underutilized, I think the most utilizes account and payment validation, right? And then you step through, that's probably the most utilized today. Then you go down the next level is automated transaction monitoring. How many companies are doing that? Then it's my personal favorite is employee training on detection prevention. So I think the human factors matter the most. At the end of the day, there's always a human who will typically make a mistake. So we talk about payment-specific training to our customers. Like, you have to give your employees payment-specific training. We all know about those bad links that you click on, the phishing emails. So it's not just general cybersecurity training, which is still very important, but payment-specific training of what to look for, what to be careful of, not sending. We all laugh and joke about, the CEO text of like, it's a please buy me a gift card. Those total scams, right? And then some of them are really, really interesting. It's the old Nigerian prince email scam from 20 years ago. Now it's CEO scams and executive scams. And as you go through from the top, account payment validation, as I said, then it's employee training. Do you have a data security officer? And so stepping all the way through of who's responsible for data, who is responsible for keeping employees safe, and who's responsible for rolling out the training as well. So I think it's a mix of technology for sure, then also that human factor as well. I think that's really the most important thing.
That's really good. I was encouraged on every point that you had said, right? The payment-specific security training. It's, like you said, don't stick a thumb drive in you picked up in the parking lot. We all get that, right? You also mentioned validation services, because that's where they're targeting to make changes so that you send payments to the other area or to another area. I think one of the perspectives, and you and I have chatted about this, is, if our defenses have to step up, it's about technology, it's about services, it's about structures, it's about the human element, keeping them trained up. And, if someone's paranoid about security, a couple of years later, that might be just normal, or that's a standard of good corporate conduct.
Yeah.
And it might even become not enough a few years from now. And so this whole, it's like, hey, we're good. You might be good for the moment, but the criminals aren't going to go, they put positive pay, or, they turned on their sanction filtering, or someone took some training. We're going to leave them alone forever. They're going to continue to morph and adapt and find ways through, because they've got to hit their numbers, bump those things up. Yeah, so if we talk about services, there's services, technology, structures, the human firewall. Banks offer a lot of services that are really useful for blocking certain types of behaviors or catching some of it, making sure that the human in the loop reviews it. The human firewall, getting that type of training matters. Now, you talked about a data security officer. I think that's really important. One of the things that we think, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is we think the treasurer, for companies that have treasurers that are a certain size and larger, that the treasurer is the superintendent of payments, and thereby the superintendent of payment security. The superintendent doesn't drive the bus, teach all the classes, provide security for the school campus, but they're responsible for who you connect with, what banks you connect to, levels of services, those types of things. And IT and the payment security, the cybersecurity officer, the data security officer, those all matter. Do you agree with that view, or would you nuance it differently?
I agree with it. Yeah, I think I've used the term in the past, custodians of cash and payment integrity. So very similar metaphor, right? Where the role extends beyond just moving money. They design and enforce the protection against fraud and errors and cyber threats. And we talk about, they have, beyond moving money, but they have probably about 5 key responsibilities. I think there's the risk management and governance. So treasurers act as, the financial risk managers. They safeguard liquidity, insurance compliance with like the board-approved policies, right? So they also see operational credit and cyber risk tied to payment processes. Then I think it's implementing secure processes. So they enforce segregation of duties at certain size companies, right? So they have dual approvals, they have master data validation to really prevent unauthorized transactions. And then with that regular reconciliation sanction screening, make sure those are standard practices. So it's kind of like risk management, implementing secure processes. And we talk about technology and access controls as the third one. So modern Treasury relies on role-based access control, I think. So if you have a centralized payment hub and automated workflows to minimize human error and fraud exposure, they can implement continuous monitoring and API-driven integrations out to those banks, right? So they can get real-time visibility and control from the technology. And also, I think the role of a cybersecurity leadership. So we see that the modern treasurers, they really champion cyber resiliency by collaborating with IT and security, and they make sure their systems are working. They are, to use the old term, patched, right? If there is a vulnerability, it gets patched quickly. Access rights are reviewed and fraud prevention tools are deployed. And they often push for cybersecurity to remain a standing item on audit and risk agendas. So if they have an internal audit teams, it's cybersecurity is really in this. So it's playing that leadership role and collaborating with IT and security. And the fifth and final one, I think fraud prevention and response. So, with the stat of 77% of businesses being targeted, treasurers lead efforts to implement those multi-layered security protocols and their education and maintaining business continuity plans. So it's risk management governance, secure processes, technology and access controls, cybersecurity leadership, and getting that fraud prevention with technology and training as well.
That was excellent. You talked about payment hubs that take payments from the beginning or the start of a system all the way and deliver it securely. And it's more and more companies are using those because of the end-to-end protection. It is surprising sometimes you run into companies. It's like they've got 15 payment flows running through the payment hub, and then they've got 6 that are outside unprotected. It's like, move it all into the secure process. Yeah, that was excellent. One thing that I think is useful for people to know about, and I spoke with one of your colleagues on this on a recent webinar. We talked about payment rail requirements, and we talked about Nacha or the ACH network in particular. But just in terms of background, and feel free to jump in at any point, but we see payment rails like card rails or SWIFT messaging rails or the automated clearinghouse or EFT networks and associations working to create a standard or a level that everyone has to adhere to protect the overall network. Because if fraud is too high, people stop using those rails or they won't trust them. So it was about 20 years ago, PCI DSS, the payment card industry data security standards were set up, and they required people to do certain things. And every year there's updates to that, right, to protect card data to reduce losses. And it's probably been about 10 years since SWIFT created the SWIFT CSP or Customer Security Program. And that was same thing to protect the SWIFT messaging network. So the endpoints would be secure, so bad messages aren't being entered. And not just done the same thing. I was just going to step through a few of those items. You and I spoke about them.
Yeah.
And what's changing, I'll just do a couple highlights. We've moved sort of from this passive to active element. So, companies submit ACH transactions through their bank, which in the wording and phrasing of Nacha is the originating depository financial institution. So when they submit it there, they're sort of attesting that everything's fine. And the receiving depository financial institution is passive. They're not supposed to have to worry about things. So that's how it's been for decades. But now, coming into 2026, the receiving bank of those messages has to monitor incoming ACH transactions for suspicious activity. And they have to take action without waiting for the ODFI's instructions. And this is a pretty significant change. So they have to look for anomalies like high volume of transactions, if there's non-standard benefits and payroll looks different. There's mismatches of names and accounts. So that's a significant change.
Yeah. So you speak to different companies across the country, like we do, from a different perspective. How are companies preparing for that, and what's their point of view?
Yeah, it's a good question because like that's on the bank side, and so you could say, oh, companies don't have to do anything because that's from the bank side. And there's same thing on the originating bank. There's increased detection activity. Well, banks aren't going to sit there and say, I'm just going to take on all the responsibility. They're going to continue to require more from their customers, either on the receiving end or the sending end. So, there's aspects of, companies that originate more than 6 million entries in a year in a 12-month period. They're required to monitor fraud risk. So there's more expectations placed on the banks to those in the pattern. But there's also, this is what's really interesting to me, Paul, is there's a number of requirements and changes for corporations that is coming down from the largest originators of ACH. You think about non-bank financial institutions, they send tens of millions of ACHs or receive, well, mostly they're originating tens of millions of transactions, either debits, which is to pull money to them, let's say to pay for a insurance policy, or to send money out. And so there's a number of requirements and changes coming to corporations in the fraud monitoring arena. So there's requests for returns, there's company entry description. Company entry description seems so esoteric. It's codes that come through a file, but those eventually show up on the bank statement. So
yeah,
there's requirements that you may have to change what's set up in your back end system to comply. So, example might be, hey, I'm doing payroll. It needs to say PR or pay or something like that. And so those are requirements that are due by different periods of time. Some are due by April 1st, March 20th. And there's different elements of fraud monitoring that has to take place. So for some that have really large volumes of transactions, they have to do things earlier. But it's rolling and catching all organizations up. So to your question, what do they need to do?
Yeah.
They need to know what these changes are, which ones affect them, when, and what's a reasonable way of addressing them. And this is not something that people are really aware of unless they've heard it on a podcast or unless their banker talked to them about it. So I think there's a massive number of companies, the vast majority, are unprepared for this.
Yeah, we talked earlier about the awareness gap, right, of synthetic fraud. I think this sounds like it's a similar issue of an awareness gap of a big impending deadline coming.
It is. So we're doing, we do consulting, research, and content, and so we're working with a bunch of our customers to do like quarterly updates. What's happening? What does this mean? And then if they need help or assistance in particular areas, we're doing that. And so we can't protect payments if we're not protecting the payment rails. And that requires everybody who participates to do something. And it's nice to think we're in good shape if we're unaware of that there are things to do. But as soon as you find out, you realize we're behind. We have things that we have to report and work on.
Yeah, and as you mentioned earlier, if I implement and you don't, you become a target pretty quickly, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really the case. And so we would expect other payment rails to add additional requirements as well over time. You have new payment rails. It's like everyone has to protect the network. Paul, this has been a really fun conversation. I know we've covered a lot of things that we didn't necessarily talk through in our initial outline, which has been great. But I was wondering if you could talk through any final thoughts or call to action items that you thought would be useful to leave with the audience.
Well, for sure, download the report is probably the number one thing. But I think overall, though, anyone listening has to really take fraud seriously. That starts by evaluating or reevaluating your controls. Are you protected as you think you are? And that thinking of 4 areas, secure all those 4 areas. It's processes, technology, systems, and people. Are you training your people? Do you have the right systems in place? Do you have the right technology deployed? And do you have the right processes? And what you mentioned there, Craig, is preparing for these new requirements. Do you know what's coming around the corner? Do you have your people ready for what's coming around the corner? Because going back to the very, very top of what we talked about, fraud is growing, fraud is changing, and the landscape is shifting rapidly. So being proactive in your fraud prevention is really the only safe path. And it's not resting on your laurels, because those cyber criminals for $200 a month now, they can have very, very sophisticated fraud attacks very cheaply. So you have to be always vigilant, always be aware, and always thinking about those 4 things: processes, technology, systems, and people.
Thanks so much, Paul. This was excellent. For those looking for the survey report, you can see that in the show notes on strategictreasurer.com. For those looking to learn more about Bottomline and what they offer, you can see that in the show notes as well at bottomline.com. Thank you so much, Paul.
Excellent. Thanks, Craig.
You've reached the end of another episode of the Treasury Update podcast. Be sure to follow Strategic Treasurer on LinkedIn. Just search for Strategic Treasurer. This podcast is provided for informational purposes only, and statements made by Strategic Treasurer LLC on this podcast are not intended as legal, business, consulting, or tax advice. For more information, visit and bookmark strategictreasurer.com.